Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Maranatha Global Bible Study on the Book of Revelation. We are back in chapter 20 today. Good to be back with you as we're finally making some more progress here in this chapter. We've camped out on verses 1 through 6 for the last three sessions. Kind of made some detours into some different areas of topical study, talking about what it means to be the people of the kingdom in this present evil age, and also what it will be like in the coming age of the millennium. We've spent some time exploring the Lord's promises regarding the gathering of his covenant people Israel and his ruling over the nations from Jerusalem. Our part as the saints of the nations ruling with him during the millennium, and also the renewal of the earth and of all things as Jesus takes his throne in the city of David. So today we want to finally kind of move along here from verses 1 through 6. We're going to camp out in verses 7 through 10 today, talking about an interesting topic, I think, one that isn't often explored and that we don't have much detail about. So unfortunately, there is some conjecture in this session, but also a lot of solid Bible teaching as we do our best to glean what we can out of these verses regarding the last rebellion of Satan and those who follow him at the end of Jesus' millennial kingdom, the end of the 1,000-year reign of Christ. So far in the chapter, we've talked about Satan being locked in the abyss for 1,000 years, so as not to deceive the nations. We talked about the righteous dead who resisted the beast and his mark, and all of the righteous dead throughout the ages being raised together to life in resurrection bodies in what's called the first resurrection, the blessed resurrection, and also how those saints who are raised to life with Christ rule and reign with him in a royal priesthood for 1,000 years. Today we want to zero in on the first three verses of the chapter again, just kind of refresh ourselves on what's going on with Satan in the abyss and that kind of side plot there. And we're going to pick it back up again at the end of the 1,000 years in verse 7. So again, starting with verse 1, I'm going to read the first three verses and then I'll skip ahead. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit, or the abyss, and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and shut it, and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer, until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while. Skipping ahead to verse 7. And when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison, and he will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. And they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Wow. Interesting story here. So let's do like Tears for Fears and break it down again. Any of you between the ages of 40 and 60 will get that. If you don't, you might have to Google it. There are 7 observations as I was going through this passage that I made. You may be able to make more. That's great. If you do, go ahead and comment on YouTube and let us know what those things are. I'd love to interact with you there. Most of you, some of you not so much. But starting with our first observation, and this is kind of the obvious one, the overarching one, and that is there will be one final rebellion against King Jesus and his people at the end of the millennial kingdom. For most of this study, we've been focusing on the conflict between the beast and the people of God before the return of Jesus, before the beginning of that millennial kingdom. But here what we read is at the end of that 1,000 years, there will be another brief conflict. And in some ways, it looks like the first conflict, although we aren't given many details about it. And this has led to some confusion about the millennial kingdom that perhaps either Joel or I will cover in a future session in the different systems that interpret the millennial kingdom of Christ, premillennialism, postmillennialism, and amillennialism. I'm not going to get into those today. I'm going to presuppose our premillennial position today and say that we believe the millennium is yet future. And so therefore, at the end of that 1,000-year reign of Christ, there will be yet another brief conflict between Satan and those who he deceives from the nations that come against Jerusalem for one final battle. Not much of a battle, but I guess you could call it one. So that's the first observation, is this is a separate conflict between Satan and those who he deceives and the people of God after the millennial reign of Jesus. Observation number 2, this rebellion begins when Satan is released from the abyss, quote, for a little while, end quote, as it says in verse 3 of this chapter. And that's recalling verse 7, and when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison. So, important to point out here that Satan doesn't break out. He doesn't somehow push through the seal of the covering over the abyss and break out of his prison. He is released. It says that he must be released for a short time. We'll talk about what that must means a little bit later in the session, but for now, we just want to make the point. He's not breaking out. He's not sneaking out. Somebody isn't coming along and letting him out against the Lord's will. The Lord is allowing him to be released for a short time at the end of the 1,000 years. And this is in keeping with the pattern of the book of Revelation, going all the way back to chapter 6, when the rider on the white horse, who we determine to be the Antichrist, the beast, is given authority over the nations. He's given authority from the throne of God. So as always, Satan does not act on his own authority. And his minions, the powers of the air, and his human puppets, the Antichrist and the false prophet, do not act on their own authority. They are given authority, temporary authority, limited authority by God himself. And this is one of those difficult things to understand and to accept when we're considering what they are allowed to do and the effects that their plots and devices and actions have on humanity and on the earth. It's hard to reconcile the fact that it is God who is allowing them to do it, that God is the one giving them the authority. And that might be a good topic for us to revisit again. We've already discussed it once at the beginning of the study, but it might be good for us to revisit again at the end of the study. Why does God give Satan authority to do these things on the earth? For now, I just want to make the observation that this is true. He is giving Satan this authority. He is the one releasing him from the abyss and allowing him to roam the earth to instigate one more rebellion against God. Third observation, Satan is allowed to, quote, deceive the nations at the four corners of the earth and, quote, gather them for battle. Verse 8, and he will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. So not only is Satan released in order to roam the nations and to begin deceiving men and women again, but he's given broad authority over the four corners of the earth. This isn't just a region. This isn't just the area around Jerusalem. This isn't just 2 or 3 people groups. This is broad global authority that he is given. And with that authority, he is able, with his deceptive wiles, with his craftiness, to deceive a great number of mortal people. Remember, at this point, on the face of the earth, you have both immortal resurrected people ruling and reigning with Christ. Those are people he cannot corrupt. But you also still have mortal people left on the earth. There's a remnant of humanity, although small, that survives the Great Tribulation into the millennial kingdom. And we talked last time about how, with the absence of war and disease and the partial removal of the curse on creation to allow for extended lifespans once again, what might look like pre-flood lifespans of 900 to 1,000 years for mortal people, that we would begin to see the earth repopulating very quickly. All of those events, both natural and man-made events that limit the human population, will be partially or fully lifted during the millennial reign of Jesus. And so humanity goes from, as it says, being like precious stone on the earth, very few mortal people left after Jesus is done judging the nations. We once again see this large population on the earth, this reconstituted, recovered global population by the end of the millennial reign of Christ, such that the enemy is able to build an army that it says is uncountable, innumerable, like the sand on the seashore. So just imagine this for a minute. The enemy goes out into the nations. We don't know for how long of a period this is, and begins provoking mortal humanity, humanity that hasn't seen war, that hasn't seen weapons, that has known perfect justice in a perfectly governed kingdom for 1,000 years, but many of whom are nonetheless mortal and still fallen. That is, their behavior may be restrained by the fact that they live under this perfect government, and there is no satanic power to deceive them for 1,000 years. But once that satanic power is released once again, and once that rebellion begins to make momentum across the earth, we begin to see a large army falling in behind the enemy and marching straight for Jerusalem, of course, which is always the enemy's prize. That leads us to observation number 4. They will march on the camp of the saints in Jerusalem, verse 9, part 1. And they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. So again, the enemy's strategy, his ultimate target, his ultimate prize is always the people of the covenant and the city of the covenant. Every time. The enemy may go after one group or another. He may instigate one group or another against one another. But ultimately, in the end, the enemy's prize is always the people of the covenant, whether that be the natural branches, the Jewish people, or the grafted in branches, and that would be us, the Gentiles. If you're not Jewish and watching, that's us, Gentiles who have been grafted into the covenant through faith in Christ. We're always his number one target, and the city of God, Jerusalem, is always also his number one target. And when we are there, he and his army march straight for us. So there's no messing around. There's no temporary side quest, or so to speak, or anything like that. The enemy is coming straight for the prize in this last rebellion. Observation number 5. Before they can reach the city to assault it, the Lord rains fire from heaven and consumes them. This is not a successful invasion. Like the invasion of the Antichrist and his armies, which were also vast, into the land that we've talked about so far in this study. So before the millennial kingdom, the Antichrist and his armies are allowed to invade the land, are allowed to take God's people captive, are allowed to occupy the city of Jerusalem for 1,260 days, according to chapter 11. But this time they're not. God does not allow his people to go through another tribulation, another great tribulation. He does not allow another Jacob's trouble at the end of the 1,000 years. He has already promised that when he regathers his people, as we went through those passages in the prophets last session, he's already promised his people that's not going to happen again. That he will gather them back to their land and they will dwell there in safety forever. And they will never be bothered by their neighbors or by the nations ever again. So Satan, for whatever reason, and we'll talk about that reason in a minute, is allowed to regather this giant army at the end of Jesus' 1,000-year reign. He is not allowed any authority over the saints this time. As it says in Daniel 7, that the little horn is given authority to conquer the saints. He's not given authority to conquer the saints in this sequel to the Gog invasion. He is stopped before, he and his army, his hordes, are stopped before they can get to the gates of the city, and God just rains fire down on them. Doesn't mess around, no big battle, no big complicated thing. They are just immediately wiped out by fire and sulfur, Sodom and Gomorrah style. So amen and amen. Thank you, that Lord, that we would never have to go through a second great tribulation. This rebellion is short. Can't say it's sweet, but it is short. Observation number 6. Satan meets his ultimate demise in the lake of fire to be tormented forever. Verse 10, and the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. So that's it for Satan. Game over. No more temporary prison time in the abyss. No more letting him out for a sequel of an invasion of Jerusalem. No more allowing him to deceive the nations. He is now in the lake of fire, and that is the final, not resting place, but the final dwelling place of all of those who rebel against God, including the devil himself. So this is the end of the road for Satan. He is now in the lake of fire with the beast and the false prophet, and all three of them will be tormented there day and night forever and ever. It's the end of the line for demonic powers. So Satan's sort of progressive fall is finally complete. It began with his rebellion against God in the beginning, when he was cast out of the third heaven, so to speak, out of the throne room of God, and he kind of inhabited that middle territory. You could call it the second heaven. You could call it the air, as the Apostle Paul calls them, the powers of the air, that sort of spiritual space where spiritual beings can operate right now. They are removed from that space and cast down to the earth at the midpoint of the 70th week of Daniel, at the beginning of the Great Tribulation. They lose all their authority in the spiritual realm and are cast down to the earth, but they're given great authority on the earth until the return of Jesus and the death of the Antichrist and the false prophet, where Satan is cast down in the abyss. So he's been progressively cast out lower and lower and lower until he's in the pit. He's temporarily allowed to return to the earth to provoke this final rebellion, but then at the very end, he's cast out before he can achieve his goals of invading the city again, into the lake of fire. And that's all she wrote. The fat lady has sung, "The devil is dead." Ding dong, the devil's dead. Amen. All right, observation number 7. Here we're backing up a little bit into the middle of verse 8, where John refers in his narrative to this horde that's marching on Jerusalem as Gog and Magog. That's an interesting description. And it might lead one to believe, and has led many to believe, that John is linking this final rebellion with the events described in Ezekiel 38 and 39, the Gog war, in which Gog and his armies from four nations that are on four sides of Israel invade the land of Israel at God's provocation. And has led others to conflate all of those events, to say that this final rebellion of the Antichrist comes at the end of the 1,000-year reign of Christ, Jacob's trouble, the Great Tribulation, and not at the beginning. Okay? So today we're going to talk about a few reasons why we believe that this reference to Gog and Magog is not the same as the Gog of the land of Magog war described in Ezekiel 38 and 39. Really briefly, I'll quote Ezekiel 38, verse 2. This is the Lord speaking to Ezekiel, telling him what to say to Gog. And this is how he addresses Gog. He says in verse 2, Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. So here you've got a very specific reference to a specific king who is king over a very particular territory and chief prince of particular cities. And if you've watched any of Joel's teachings on Ezekiel 38 or 39 or read many speaks, you know that most scholars will identify the land of Magog as being within the territory of modern-day Turkey, either in Anatolia, which is central Turkey, kind of the heartland of the Turkish people, or possibly Lydia, which is the western part of Turkey. In the New Testament, Sardis, one of the churches that Jesus speaks to in the first 3 chapters of Revelation, is the capital of what was then Lydia, which some scholars have identified with Magog. So either way, we're talking about is a very specific territory in the modern nation of Turkey today is Magog, and a particular king named Gog being king over that territory. John's reference to Gog and Magog in Revelation 20, verse 8, is more generic. He's speaking about the nations gathering against Jerusalem, saying, quote, and he will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them to battle. So we're not talking about a king named Gog from a land of Magog. We're talking about nations from the four corners of the earth around the globe being referred to as Gog and Magog. Not Gog of the land of Magog, but Gog and Magog. So this is a much more generic reference that John is making. And yes, he is making a connection, obviously, back to Ezekiel 38 and 9, but not in the sense that he's saying this is that. He's not directly identifying this rebellion as being the events of Ezekiel 38 and 39. He's using the language of Gog and Magog, not Gog of the land of Magog, to identify this final rebellion as yet another attempt in the spirit of Gog, symbolically in the spirit of Gog, to march on Jerusalem and conquer God's people. This is incidentally not the first time that John has used this method of connecting very specific events with more general symbolic concepts in the book of Revelation. Another example of this takes place in chapter 11, verses 7 and 8. In reference to the two witnesses who are prophesying in Jerusalem and who we would say at the end of the Great Tribulation are overcome by the Antichrist and killed and then resurrected in the city. verses 7 and 8 of chapter 11 say, "And when they," that is the two witnesses, "have finished their testimony, the beast that rises from the bottomless pit will make war on them and conquer them and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city that is symbolically called Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified." So notice there, in referring to the city of Jerusalem while it's under occupation by the Antichrist and his forces, John refers to the city of Jerusalem where Jesus was crucified, so it's clear which city we're talking about here, as Sodom and Egypt. And he even uses the phrase symbolically is called Sodom and Egypt. So it's not that we literally call Jerusalem Sodom, or literally call Jerusalem Egypt, or that it will ever be literally called that. He's relating that language to the city as it exists under the Antichrist's occupation. It's Egypt in the sense that it's the place where God's people are in bondage and forced to labor. We know from Zechariah 14 that when the forces of the Antichrist come into the city, half of the city will be taken into exile. The other half of the city, the Jewish population of the city, that is, will remain. And we can only imagine what kind of slavery will exist for the Jewish people during that time. It will very much be like their time in bondage in Egypt under Pharaoh. Also Sodom, while the city is under Antichrist's occupation, the city is wicked as if it were Sodom. So here again, John is using these phrases, these names of places, to refer symbolically to what's happening in Jerusalem at the time of the Great Tribulation. In the same way, in chapter 20, when referring to Satan's final rebellion against the Lord and his people, where he's going out to deceive the nations and raise a great army that will come against Jerusalem, much as he did at the beginning of the Great Tribulation under the man Gog of the land of Magog. John connects those events back to the language of Ezekiel 38 and refers to that great horde approaching the city as Gog of Magog in a symbolic sense, much as he did in chapter 11 with Jerusalem. I'll go even a little bit further, and this is speculation. Unfortunately, with very brief passages like this that we aren't given many details about, sometimes it's not wrong to speculate, but I will call this out as speculation, that during this final rebellion, there could actually be a revival of the name and of the spirit of Gog. That these people may actually be marching in the name of Gog and Magog. There may be sort of a revival of the spirit of Gog, and they may be marching under the banner of Gog and Magog. So there may be a literal sense in which Gog and Magog enters into this battle, and that these people are sort of reviving his name, which seems kind of crazy because you would think, well, but don't they know that Gog was defeated? I mean, don't they know what the end of Gog was when Jesus came and killed him with the breath of his mouth and buried him in a common grave? I mean, as we talked about in the previous session, you'll be able to, in the kingdom, go to the burial place of Gog and his hordes east of the sea and see where they were all buried. Why would anyone be crazy enough to lead a rebellion in the name of Gog at the end of the 1,000-year reign of Christ? I can't speak for why people do things, only that, remember, they're under satanic deception. And the enemy is very crafty, and he knows how to put a thing in our minds and convince us that this time it will be different. Who knows what the world will be like after 1,000 years of peace and tranquility and perfect government. There could be incredible technology at that point. And the enemy could convince the mortals who are left on the earth, as he's deceiving there may be human leaders that rise up on behalf of Satan to deceive the nations. And they may say, but this time we have the technology we need, or the ability that we need, or the numbers that we need to be able to conquer the city. So we're going to finish what Gog started. We're going to go in Gog's name and finish what he wasn't able to finish. And that is the final defeat of King Jesus and his people, and the extermination of God's people, and the end of the covenant. In fact, we see something very similar even today on Western university campuses and in the streets of Western cities, where people are invoking the name of Hitler against Israel and the Jewish people. This is not anymore just some fringe group of skinheads out in Idaho. Sorry if you're from Idaho, or some other place, in Europe. These are people out in the street who would call themselves liberals and progressives, invoking Hitler's name alongside Muslim people in the Middle East. Now, if you're my age, late 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, when you grew up in school or in your families, the most evil person that had ever lived in the history of the world was Adolf Hitler. And he did the most evil things that any person had ever done in starting a war that killed 20 million people, and committing the Holocaust that killed 8 million people, 6 million of them Jews. There was no doubt in anybody's mind, if you asked who the most evil person was that had ever lived, it was always Hitler. And again, you might have these sort of fringe skinhead type groups that would do the white power thing, that would do the Nazi salute or have a swastika flag. But you never saw people out on the streets marching openly in different sectors of society invoking Hitler's name. That just didn't happen until very recently. And you would think to yourself, well, don't these people know what happened to Hitler? Hitler was defeated. Germany was devastated. All of Europe was devastated, but Germany was devastated and divided. You ask the average German person today, what are your thoughts about Adolf Hitler? 99% of the time, you're not going to get a friendly answer. So how in the world could the enemy deceive people today, 2024, into believing that Hitler had it right and we're going to finish the work that Hitler started? How could you possibly do that? That is the power of demonic deception. That is the power of Satan's deceptive power. He's not dumb. He's not an idiot. He knows what works. And he is able to deceive us into believing foolishness. And we see yet another example of that here. Even 1,000 years of Jesus' bodily visible reign on the earth from Jerusalem isn't enough to drive the seed of sin out of the mortal, fallen human heart. And all it takes is the right circumstances, the right timing, and the right deceptive message coming from the enemy, coming from the serpent, the crafty serpent of the garden, to deceive us into believing crazy things. And we see that happening here again at the end of the 1,000 years, which leads me to my final question, and this is a question I think we should ask. If we're talking about a separate rebellion at the end of the 1,000-year reign that doesn't really go anywhere once it gets close to the city of Jerusalem, it's just wiped out, what's the point? Why? Why is Satan allowed to, why is he released from the abyss? Why is he allowed to deceive the nations for a short period? Why is he allowed to march on Jerusalem? Didn't Jesus decisively defeat his enemies at his return? Why do we need a repeat? Why do we need a sequel of that Gog rebellion? And I think, I just kind of alluded to the answer a minute ago, is that sin is still present on the earth throughout the millennial reign. It's muted, it's restrained by the fact that the world is governed perfectly by Jesus and by his bride, by us, the saints. And Satan is not on the earth to deceive the nations during the 1,000 years. So there's much less sin on the face of the earth, and what sin there is restrained by the righteous government of Jesus and by the lack of weapons and warfare. Yet it is still there. Sin is still there, lurking under the surface. I heard a preacher refer to the sinful nature as a fish tank. You might have heard this analogy before, where you look at a fish tank when it's undisturbed and the water looks clear and it looks nice and it looks clean. But if you bump the fish tank, what happens? All the sediment that's settled on the bottom floats up into the water, and suddenly the water looks dirty and cloudy. And so for 1,000 years, the nations have been like that undisturbed fish tank, and everything looks clean and clear. But Satan comes along like he does and bumps the fish tank, and all of a sudden, all that dirty sediment flies up into the air, and all that sin that's been lying dormant in the human heart for so long is once again awakened, at least in the mortals who are alive on the earth at that point. So not all mortals are redeemed. Obviously, there will be mortals who follow Jesus, probably many. There will be, as there are today, many who claim to follow Jesus and profess to follow Jesus, but all it takes is the right opportunity, right circumstances and opportunity to find out they don't. And they will follow the enemy when he leads this rebellion. And there's obviously will be those who pay lip service publicly, but in their hearts and behind closed doors, they don't know him and they don't want to know him. And it just takes the right leaders saying the right things to lead them astray. So, where sin is still present, the Lord has a way of allowing it to be exposed, to provoke it out into the open. He has done that many times in the past, we see throughout Scripture. He's going to do that in the Great Tribulation, the time when the mystery of iniquity is revealed for what it is, and the enemy and those who follow him, who take his mark, are given a brief period. It says that the 10 kings of the earth are given an hour of authority over the saints during the Great Tribulation, because the Lord is provoking this iniquity up to the surface. The cup of his wrath is filling up. The cup of iniquity is filling up, and he's going to make the nations drink it down to the dregs when Jesus returns. So likewise, at the end of the 1,000-year reign, because sin is still present on the earth, even though we can see Jesus visibly, bodily reigning from Jerusalem, the Lord's going to provoke that sin one more time to come to the surface. And he's going to do so, as he always does, allowing the enemy to provoke the nations to lead this rebellion. And when this great horde, this great army comes to the gates of Jerusalem, he's going to deal with Satan and with sin once for all. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the next session for the great white throne judgment. But for today, making the point that once this great horde of an army is gathered together, once those whose hearts are still in rebellion against Jesus, still in rebellion against the covenant, still in rebellion against God, once they come to the gate of the city, the enemy is going to attempt one more final battle against God and his people, and the Lord is going to immediately put it down. So that will be it. It's very possible that this last rebellion will be made up of mortals who didn't see the return of the Lord, who were born after that. Even if lifespans are allowed to return to pre-flood levels, which was the longest person that we know of that ever lived, was Methuselah at 969 years. This is at the end of 1,000 years. So even if you were a child when Jesus returned and allowed to survive into the millennium, which I believe mortal children will be allowed to survive into the millennium if they're surviving at Jesus' return, you're not living past, 900, 950, 960 years, which means once we reach 1,000 years, Those who were alive, who saw the return of Jesus, who saw the judgment of Gog and his armies, the Antichrist, at Jesus' return, who saw Jesus deal with his enemies, are all dead. Or at least the mortals are. And we have this new generation of mortals who has arisen since then, who didn't see those events at the beginning of the millennial reign of Christ, who are now provoked into this rebellion at the end of the 1,000-year reign. And we've, once again, seen this throughout history, that once events pass out of living memory, often the next generation that arises is very vulnerable to commit those same sins, to repeat that same history. And again, we see that happening right now. World War II and the Holocaust is passing out of living memory. Those who can remember those events, who saw the camps with their eyes, who lived through those things, are dying out quickly. And we see a new generation arising who is threatening to repeat that same history on a much bigger and more devastating scale. So I would apply that same principle here. At the end of the millennium, those mortals who remember the return of Jesus are gone, and those who are alive on the earth, although they may have learned about it, there's something different about learning about something, reading about it in a book, or watching about it in a movie, and living through it. And when things pass from living memory, those who didn't live through them don't feel the same weight of those events as those who did. So, okay, we are setting ourselves up for God's final confrontation with sin. And we'll read a little bit more about that at the end of chapter 20 in the Great White Throne Judgment in the next session. But for now, as always, thank you for joining us. It's been great to go through this passage, to break it down with you, and to examine it, to exegete it. Also, once again, to use our imaginations and to speculate a little bit. And hopefully I was able to distinguish the difference between those two things. We definitely need to hold to what we glean out of Scripture. But then it's always okay as well, I think, to think and ponder on those things, about how they might be true, how they might play out in reality. So once again, love you all. Thanks for joining us. Blessings to you, and Maranatha.